So my name is Heather Flanagan, and I am, among other things, the lead editor for a white paper that came out a few weeks ago called Government-Issued Digital Credentials and the Privacy Landscape. This paper, how many of you have read the paper? Awesome. How many of you have heard the paper? More? Good. Okay, the paper is not short, and so you're not going to suddenly look it up and read it during the session. Just giving you that little bit of a heads up because it's about 70 pages long.
We will know if you do.
We're watching. We're watching you down there. So there will be a link to the paper at the end of these slides. If you just can't wait, then go to openid.net and scroll down a little bit, and you will see the announcement for the paper, which includes a link.
Nice. I'm Mike Kiser. I'm the Director of Strategy and Standards at SailPoint, but I don't want to talk about me. I want to talk about a government-issued credential that I don't own. I want to talk about the government-issued credential that Heather owns. Heather, is there a date on your government-issued credential?
There is, in fact.
What was not the year, but the first part?
Well, it's a very important date, and the date is May 31st.
Which means that today is Heather's birthday. So, we're all going to stop right here, just take a deep breath, and someone's going to harmonize, and we're all going to sing her happy birthday. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Heather. Happy birthday to you. Yay!
Aww. You guys, that's now been recorded for posterity.
Note to self, always schedule talks on your own birthday. This could happen to you.
It could. And now I'm just going to have to sort of sit here looking at the. Okay, no, we're good. We will keep going.
But despite your birthday, what do you not have?
Pockets? They're like, oh, here, do you want to put this in your, oh, maybe not. How about hang it? No, that's not going to work. Why? Because I'm a girl and I still don't have pockets.
Leading into the talk, we wanted to talk about how mobile devices are the new pockets, because that's where these government-issued credentials are going. What do I mean by they're the new pockets? Boy, it echoes in here. Well, take the New York Times. They put out an article in 1899, believe it or not. I can give you the URL later, that argues that pockets have a lot of uses, right? A letter to mail, a fountain pen, I'm not sure who puts that in their pocket, timetable, a bicycle road directory, maybe a picture of someone. There's a lot of things. In fact, the New York Times goes further and argues that pockets are the key to great civilization. It argues that no civilization has ever been great since the invention of pockets that didn't have pockets. You want to be a great civilization? You have to have pockets. This list is fascinating for another reason, though, and it's because all of these characteristics, especially the ones in yellow, maybe not the chewing tobacco, remind me of this. I'm an old person, by which I mean I could remember when I thought, man, I wish I had one device that could take pictures and call people and do, well, now we have it, right? It does almost all those things that the New York Times is arguing for, except for identity on some level, right? We have some strong facial authentication, biometric authentication, but identity is still kind of lacking, and that's what this paper is talking about for governments.
Absolutely. So I'm not going to go into the whole paper because, as I mentioned, it is kind of long, but I'm going to tell you what to look for. So the first part of the paper is looking really at that current landscape of, well, what's happening in the world today? I looked at what's happening in India, which is probably the largest deployment of digital credentials, government-issued digital credentials in the world. I looked at Singapore, one of the most ubiquitous. We looked at Europe in general, and then Italy in specific, mostly because everybody was looking at Estonia, and I wanted to look at something that was a little bit more what I considered realistic. We looked at Nigeria, which is the biggest population in Africa that's rolling out an EID card. And then, looking at moving to North America, what's happening in the U.S., which is a little bit schizophrenic because, it's the U.S. and that's what we do.
And as Heather and the people on the paper looked at all of these different initiatives to have government-issued credentials, you realize they're all, as she already noted, very different, right? That's because there are a number of gaps and risks that exist as they start to move through this process. Just kind of at a high level, they kind of fall into three categories. The paper goes into a lot more detail. But the first of these is motivations or incentives. Every country, every nation has a different incentive for issuing government-based credentials. If you are a further developed country where the healthcare and the economic infrastructure is already there, it may be issuing digital credentials is a matter of convenience. If you're less developed, issuing these credentials may be a means of enabling and granting financial access to markets or to healthcare, to other solutions. That difference in motivation plays a significant role when you think about how to sell the notion or the support of a government-issued identity, right? If it's a well-developed country, you're going to focus on convenience, speed of use. If it's more of a financial motivation, then you might start thinking about how doing it well is basically minimizes economic risk. Another area that influences these movements are technological limits. These standards and the different technologies that come into play are fairly complex. The interactions between them are sometimes difficult to predict, especially when you have data at scale. The more data you have, the easier it is to identify someone, the easier it is privacy can be tread upon or other fundamental rights as well. And then finally, the missing protection in existing approaches. Every country does things differently. Some of them carve out governments as exceptions to standards or privacy regulations, saying organizations and corporations are one thing, but the government has such a different role that we're going to carve out a space for them.
They're
all
here
of
to help.
these, go ahead.
They're here to help.
Right. All of these interact together, which is why we have a Venn diagram. Didn't label the intersections because it's too messy, but if you think about it, your motivation is going to impact your technology use. Your technology use is going to impact how you think about privacy and the overall well-being of your constituents. So it's a very complicated picture.
It is, but never fear, all is not lost. It's just, it needs a better GPS. So the paper does have some recommendations. At the start, it goes to say, okay, there's still basic things that collectively, globally, we need to get right. And these are things that we have talked about and talked about and talked about, and yet we still aren't universally getting them correct. We need to make sure that the individual has agency, that the individual has some level of control and some level of choice as to what's happening with their information. There needs to be transparency in the system so that as things are happening, as data is being moved and shared and whatnot, that this is auditable action. Data minimization, that's just sort of a fundamental security concept that, you can't, what we used to say, I used to work at Stanford University, and we would say you can't be subpoenaed for data you don't have. And that was a very wonderful thing. We did not want the data, and making sure all of that was minimized was just really one of our most basic practices. And selective disclosure. I actually, while some of this is a bit new when it comes to standard, it's still a basic function when you think about it that you want to only release the data that has to be released, similar to the data minimization component. There are ongoing concerns. You're stepping past the basics of, okay, so those are sort of fundamentals, and that's great and wonderful, but you cannot be talking about government-issued digital credentials without addressing some immediate concerns in the privacy space. Top of the list. You can't have this conversation without talking about surveillance. Now, the thing about government-issued digital credentials is the government is the source of truth for that data in many, many, many respects. And yet the concern is that the government is now going to see how you're using that, and that can be a source of significant concern for many. So you need to think about how to address that as you are rolling out these programs to your population. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is another area that immediately gets touched on as soon as you start talking about privacy. Frankly, it deserves its own paper because it's not a one-to-one thing, right? Privacy and DEI are related issues, but that's another Venn diagram where they overlap, but they're not a one-to-one thing. So I did want to mention it, but also mention that it's a really big topic to be thinking about. There's the concerns of single points of failure. Some of the larger governments that are doing this are very, very centralized in how they're trying to maintain all of these things. And that's a little bit scary, thinking about what happens when you put all of those eggs in one great big basket. You can't have these conversations with saying, okay, well, let's say you've got relying parties that have properly registered saying, yes, we're doing the right thing, and so we should be able to access data. And the government says, yes, you can see that data. And then now they have that data. It's sort of like in their own data warehouse, and you've got them doing special marketing or special tracking or special something. It's inappropriate use by people who actually legitimately have the data. So another problem, another area where you really need to be thinking hard about how you design your systems. And last but not least, another particularly challenging thing when it comes to these types of credentials is how many of you are from the US? Have you noticed recent administration changes where they seem to go a little bit back and forth in terms of what's considered good and what's considered bad? And one administration says that the other administration was terrible and tries to undo everything they did? That makes actually designing some of the protections into law and regulation really hard. So figuring out how to have sustainable protections is an ongoing concern for these that, again, needs to be brought into the architecture.
But that's not all.
But wait, there's more.
There's a whole realm of things that are emerging that either are not that new and taking on new aspects or are kind of the new hotness, right? Not starting with digital warfare, that's not the new hotness. But in a warfare scenario, privacy regulations and the use of government-issued IDs take on a new aspect. So thinking about how to protect citizens' privacy while yet still enabling the state to be on a different footing is important. Secondarily, deep fakes, which I think we've all seen at least one of this week, is a whole issue in terms of not just voice, not just face, but anything that's faking a synthetic identity, circumventing facial recognition checks. These types of things are another thing we need to think about. Then followed by entirely synthetic worlds like the metaverse. What does it look like if there is no necessarily physical straight analogy to what's being seen or it's being thought of? We need to think semantically about what the significance is there ethically and what the implications are for these credentials. And then finally, similar to the deep fakes a little bit, is the generative AI and deep language models. Implications of veracity, implications of authenticity, what is actually generated, what is real, what is not. All of this has a role to play in these ongoing efforts to make digital credentials a reality. Things that we need to think through, both as industry and as governments and as individuals.
So one thing I would add to that last bit is there are a number of citations in the paper, and I know one of the ones that folks wanted me to add, and I think I did, were people who were actually getting government-issued digital identities using sort of that deep fake data so that it becomes an absolutely legitimate credential for a completely fictitious, illegitimate creature. So these are things that are happening now. As I mentioned, the paper was published a few weeks ago, back on May 4th. It kind of needs to be an ongoing paper because a lot of this is going to evolve. One of the things that if I was still working on the paper right this minute, I would probably add in terms of future threats a little bit more about the threat of quantum cryptography, which will be a really interesting challenge that I come out of the higher education identity space, and we are extremely SAML-based. And we have talked amongst ourselves about what happens when some of the crypto breaks for that, and we're like, yeah, then we all quit. Because we don't know how to solve that. So that's one that I think would definitely have to go on this list, and there will almost certainly be more. So if you want the paper, there's a nice long link right there. Easier link is, of course, openid.net, and then just scroll down on their main page and you will find it. And with that, if you have questions, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, you can connect with Mike on LinkedIn, or you can ask us now. How about that? Vlad, please.
Okay, so thank you very much. It's very easy. Question what I have for you is the following. When it comes to the, government-specific government data, I came from Ukraine. Right now, we have a whole wars going on. One of the biggest issues we have right now is that a lot of children basically stolen from Ukraine to Russia, and they're given away to people, their families. There's absolutely no trace. At the same time, we do have a digital signature somewhere, because some of them still have phones, and some of the phones which were stolen were traveling around. But that is a combination of kind of a government data issued by the birth certificates and the passwords and stuff, with the private company home data, right?
Right.
Cell phones. Do you see in the future more collaboration between the private industry, who has a lot of data related to the identity, and the government having another piece of data to kind of resolve problems related to refugees and innocent people and change the data, stuff like that? Because as you understand, those kids will change their names, and they will try to hide, the government Russia will try to hide it.
So the question was basically, given some of the unfortunate real cases that are happening right now in the war in Ukraine, with children being taken, and therefore their identities, even if it's on their phone very likely is not going to stay with them. What happens? Is there a form of public-private partnership that could help in this case? Maybe. I'm going to say that Elizabeth Garber, wave, is working on a paper that touches on that very thing. That paper is not out yet, but the OpenID Foundation did a series of papers. Mine was one, but hers takes a much more holistic view, and I think that topic is going to be touched on in that paper. Yes, Mark?
In the U.S., what has been kind of the temperature of the idea of digital IDs at a state-by-state level? Is that a whole other talk?
Well, so I included 3 states in the paper that I wrote. There are more states that are exploring the concept of digital credentials in the form of mobile driver's licenses. And it has been absolutely fascinating to see how different states consider this and approach this. Arizona is one that I used as an example, and the tone in that state was conservative in an unhealthy way, I would say, because people, they heard government, credential, identifier. You're tracking me, you government people, we don't trust you. And so they stood up and actually blew apart a bill which was going to increase the privacy of the mobile credentials that were being issued by the government. So the camps that are actually considering this in the US, it's very dependent on what state you're talking about, and you are going to get some of the most fascinating arguments ranging from this is brilliant, this is going to be like the next best thing, to what's called the Book of Revelations argument. All right, how many of you are familiar with that? The argument, not the book. The Book of Revelations argument, which is something that like the NIST folks have had to deal with a number of times, because people will submit concerns that anytime the government is issuing a number that feeds into the prophecy in the Book of Revelations of the end of times. So, anytime this comes up, they're like, wait a minute. Book of Revelation says you can't assign a number to me, because that's Satan's number, and that's bad. So the U.S. is a particularly fascinating landscape of what perspective would you like to hear, because someone out there has it.
I'd be curious to see the interaction of the state level and the local jurisdiction, the consumption, like
Yeah.
producing, one side's consuming.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of what that would look.
Yeah, that's going to very much end up needing its own paper because every jurisdiction is, to a certain extent, able to make some of their own choices as to what they allow and what they don't. In a similar fashion, county by county, they can decide whether they'll allow alcohol sales. And if they can get to that level, then they'll be able to say, well, what ID are you allowed to use for alcohol sales? And then, it kind of cascades from there. So,
Just add to that real quick.
sure.
Can you also expand on the same lines where the federal temperature is? Where are we headed with regulations from a federal view on things like mobile driver's license for government issues?
I don't know off the top of my head.
So this is going to get into cynical Heather moment of what do I think the federal temperature is? Well, I think that depends on whether you're talking to like the staffers in the federal government or whether you're talking to the politicians. Because I think the staffers, the folks working at NIST, the people that are just trying to do something sensible, they're not quite as worried about being reelected and presenting the extremist views that they are so wont to present. And that's prevented us from a whole lot of things in terms of, do we have comprehensive privacy regulation? Why, no. No, we don't. And that's a big problem for this country. Sir?
Where do you see ethics in this?
Everywhere.
So that concern globally, it varies country by country.
So does privacy. All right? The question is, do I see ethics entering into this? And absolutely. But one of the biggest challenges of that is what is ethical, what is considered private, is a very contextual decision, depending on where you're from, how old you are. Any number of things will feed into that. And so that does make looking at this from that global perspective, figuring out the sustainable protections that you'll need to have, really challenging. There should be. I didn't cover that, but there should be. Yeah. Paul.
So that leads on to my question. How did you look at identity theft in some of the countries that have actually implemented this? And how do citizens then go about and resolve identity theft? The identity digital and maybe someone is trying to prove to be them at the same time.
I ran out of time. I ran out of time. That is its own interesting thing of, all right, I'm trying to look at how they're presenting privacy frameworks and how they are absorbing standards and what they're actually doing. But then when you actually get your feet on the ground of, okay, you're issuing this, it's not always going to work. What are you doing? That I think you can write an encyclopedia at that point.
Right now, I think we have our digital identities. Mine is certainly still fragmented across dozens of websites and identity providers. So if I lose one, I can still, survive and figure things out.
Right.
But you think we're coming to a point where it's all going to be agglomerated into one big issue, whether it's a government issue or whatever, and the loss of that one might have extreme consequences.
Yes. Yes. Sir.
Yeah, just to respond to what he said, if we have a single issuer, single identity, I think the using mobile phone, if you look at it, will be a little bit different, become a virtual phone. Because I see image of that phone being in the cloud, so that if it is lost with your biometric identity, everything can be re-linked back on the new device. That's what I'm looking at, because if I lose my phone,
Right.
that's the end of the entity that's a problem. It's like a virtual kind of image can be in the cloud, such that if I lose that phone with my biometrics, the new phone, everything is back on the new device. We hope that the one that is lost cannot be compromised.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it's not just your Costco membership, although that might be a horrific loss, right? It's everything you relate to with the government. What I think is going to be fascinating in the States is that there are a lot of states you wouldn't expect who are working on these concepts. And when it comes to enabling voting, I'm really fascinated to watch which way they spin, because you could argue it's either more or less enfranchising, and do they want that or do they not? whoever's in control, do they want that or do they not? Make clear.
Interesting question. All right. Well, I think that brings us to end of time and that much closer to the bar. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, y'all.
Appreciate it.